Hello, g'day, and good afternoon. My name is John Humphreys, and welcome to this ATA, what are we calling it? Budget chats. We used to do these ATA Econ chats quite regularly, so let's stick with that, the chat theme, ATA Budget Chat. If you remember those old Econ chats, what we used to say is these are live, unscripted, and what's the other word? Interactive. See, that's how you can tell it's live. Live, unscripted, and interactive chats, which means we're all speaking to you directly live. So any mistakes we make, you'll see them in real time and we can't avoid them. Unscripted, as in I rough it, or Gene or Xavier or anyone else we have on is going to say. So look, we know each other. We often agree. Sometimes we don't. Hopefully we can get into a fight. It makes things more interesting. But I don't know what they're going to say. And interactive, as in we can take your comments. Feel free to start putting the comments into YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. I don't know what to call it yet. X seems like a strange name, but and we'll see those and we can interact. We can put them up on the screen, perhaps. We can also answer. And after we have a bit of a go chatting first, I'm going to try this out. Now, I'm not a tech genius. We're going to try and see if we can send out a Zoom link so that members of the public can just come into that Zoom room. I can then put the Zoom screen up onto this chat and have you, if you're just watching on Twitter and you want to yell at us or ask a question or insult us, then you can come in and get on the video and insult us live to our faces or add something of value to the conversation. So I'm going to try that out later as we go. With all of that out of the way, hello and welcome. As I said, I'm John Humphreys. I'm the ATA, Australian Taxpayers Alliance Chief Economist. With me in the room at the moment, we've got, he's down the bottom as I see him. I don't know if you guys see it the same way. Barclay McGain, who's an ATA economic researcher. And next to me, the esteemed Gene Tunny, director at Adept Economics and all-round economic guru and good guy. And we're going to be chatting to you for a while today about our thoughts. I did also ask some special guests to come along. I didn't expect it because it was very last minute. So I got to say a big thank you and shout out to the person I'm just adding in now, Xavier. Xavier, thanks for showing up at the last minute like this. I'll put you on the spot. I think all you guys know each other. Xavier Boffa runs the Samuel Griffith Society, which is an excellent nationwide organization dedicated to defending the Constitution and all things good in life. So this is, okay. This is the team we have lined up. What we're going to do is have a little look through the budget as we see it, comment on things that might not have been commented on as much elsewhere, give our take on the good, the bad, and the ugly. But before we do all that, maybe a bit of an introduction. And to do that, let's go to the most sensible person in the room. Sorry, Xavier, when I thought of saying that line, you weren't in the room. But let's go to the most sensible person in the room, Gene. Gene, could you give us a quick rundown about what the Victorians have done to us this week?
Well, I mean, it's what we expected, John. I mean, for quite a while now, we've seen the fiscal problems that Victoria has had, and it's already been downgraded 2 notches. And I mean, there's a risk there could be a further downgrade, credit rating downgrade down the track. I mean, we've learned that net debt for Victoria is going to go to 188 billion or something, and they've had to, cut relative to where they were, like make some public service cuts. But expenditure is still increasing, but they're claiming it's not going to grow as much as their gross state product. They've made, they've increased some charges. They've done at least one good thing, which is for commercial property, they're moving towards a different taxation arrangement, so away from stamp duty, which I thought was interesting. That's probably the only commendable thing in the budget I can see. But otherwise, there's various, there's some cost of living relief in terms of schools, and there's, just the general build-up of debt, which is huge because of this infrastructure program that they've got, where there's all sorts of spending you have to question. So I think a lot of this was expected. The fundamental problem they've got is that with this build-up of debt, which is now approaching 190 billion, whereas before COVID, they were only forecasting it to get up to 50 billion or something. So there's all of this extra debt that they never expected, $140 billion worth, so $140,000 million worth that they they weren't expecting. They've got to pay interest on that. The interest bill is going to get up to $9 billion by the end of the forward estimate, around 27, 28, compared with $4 billion a year ago. And that's money they can't spend on health and education. So they're in a real mess in terms of their budget. That'd be my quick summary of what's going on. But I mean, we can dive into some of the more specific measures later.
Is that your dog in the background?
Definitely not my dog.
That's actually my dog, yeah.
So I assume that's his commentary on the budget, which I guess is your way of saying you wanted to go next. So Barclay, have you got any highlights here? What's the highlights or lowlights or the quick take? If you had to explain the budget in less than a minute to a person who didn't care, what would you say?
Well, I think the big thing that stood out for me is the fact that the government has just essentially given up on a lot of their big projects that they were talking about building. So the suburban rail loop's been postponed by a further 4 years, I believe. We already know, we found out late last year that the Commonwealth Games was no longer going to be hosted by Victorian, as much as, the Allen government and prior to that, the Andrews government wanted to, paint it off as like, during this cost of living crisis created by external factors, that, we need to, have cost-cutting measures like getting rid of the Commonwealth Games. It's entirely a self-inflicted wound. And we see this because of how much the state debt has gotten up. Eventually, they're realizing that they're eventually going to have to pay that off. I think Gene hit the nail on the head when he talks about $9 billion on interest every year. And now you've got, it was that figure of about $190 billion now that they're in debt. And that's 25% of their gross state produce. And I think that's higher than New South Wales, Tasmania, and Queensland combined. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but that is like, it seems to me that like it's uncharted territory for any state that we've seen before. So it is pretty grave times. Looking at some of the measures, again, it kind of seems to be the case that they want to take away from you in a manner that's, I guess, a bit subtle and discreet, and then they just want to give it to you in like the form of, here's $400 towards your Powerball, or here's $400 towards your education. But when you actually look at it, and when you knuckle it down, you'll see that particularly people buying a home, someone like myself, is definitely going to suffer, and particularly rate payers. I mean, the ABC released a report. I actually thought it was quite a detailed report. It's a $35 rise for residential homes, $73 rise for commercial buildings, $35 rise for industrial estates, $150 rise for primary production, $13 rise for public benefit, and of course they've got a vacancy levy down in Victoria of $143. The thing that I'm interested to see playing out is, I know in the lead up to the federal election in 2022, there was a proposal that Anthony Albanese levelled, and it's a bit confusing. I don't think he really understood it himself, whereby the government would own half of your home. Now, that's actually been in place in Victoria for quite some time. I'd be interested to see if perhaps Xavier had some insight on how that's going for homeowners or potential people looking to get into the market, or perhaps yourself, John. But as I understand it, they're looking to transition to the federal government scheme eventually, to try and, I guess, ease the burden on their budget. So it will be interesting to see how that goes, or if they indeed go ahead and ditch their scheme that they started. I think it was back in 2018, just before that state election. So it is pretty grim for Victorians. I know a lot of them are moving to my state in Queensland, and the state of also Gene and John. Perhaps you'll join us one day, Xavier. I know you're up here soon for the Samuel Griffith Society, so maybe that'll be a taste of things to come for you. But it is pretty dire for Victoria. I think with a lot of the primary industry closing up, moving elsewhere, I think they're having net negative interstate migration, and it's pretty negative times, John.
Thank you. That is a pretty good segue that you've given us. Sorry, before you go on to that, it's a pretty good segue you've given us. Firstly, to do a shout out for, if anyone's nearby, Gold Coast, the 24th to the 26th of May. I'm doing your work for you, Xavier. The Samuel Griffith Society Conference. It's one of the great annual get-togethers of all right-thinking people across Australia. It's great people there, a great lineup, and a lot of fun. So if you are anywhere near Gold Coast, or even if you're just anywhere near a road or an airplane, come along to the Gold Coast. Barclay, mute yourself when you're not speaking, and join us at the Samuel Griffith Society Conference. That, by way of introduction, Xavier, as the only actual Victorian in the room, feel free to now tell us all to shut up and take the mic and tell us what actually went on.
Well, thanks, John, and thanks for your invitation. And I'm glad that I was able to join you at short notice, as you said. And thanks also for the plug. It's great this year that the Samuel Griffith Society is coming back to Queensland, where Sir Samuel lived and reigned for many years. And it's always a bit of a homecoming. So you're quite right. In a couple of weeks, we will be on the Gold Coast for another one of our conferences. And it should be a very enjoyable weekend with some very insightful and interesting conversation. I'm also very happy, and John, you might be able to share these details with people by email in due course. Very happy to share that we have a special discount for ATA members for our conference, and there'll be some discount codes you can get. And as I say, John can share those with you all in due course. But in terms of the budget, I mean, I'll leave a lot of the finer economic analysis to those who are more expert. But I do want to make probably 2 points, particularly coming from a sort of federalist perspective, or from the perspective of someone who's interested in those federal state issues. I think it sort of doesn't really bear much repeating that the state of the Victorian economy and the budget is a bit grim, if I can put it mildly. Debt's going to continue to go up. We're not going to see surplus for some time. Services are being cut. The size of government is going to grow, just at a slightly slower pace. And a lot of the government's major capital expenditure programs in infrastructure have been shelved indefinitely, effectively. And so despite putting a lot of those large expenditure items off budget by pushing them beyond the forward estimates, we're still seeing a worsening outlook overall. So, it's pretty dire in that respect. Charges are going up, taxes are going up, etc. But at the same time, there's this ongoing conversation, which really has been ongoing since at least last year, if not before, and the election of the Albanese government, of a sort of federal bailout, so to speak, for Victoria. And there's a lot of discussion about the GST distribution and other Commonwealth grants, Commonwealth infrastructure spending, and the idea that Victoria will somehow escape its current predicament by putting its hand out to the Commonwealth for extra money. I think that would be a very undesirable outcome. I think Victoria has got to get its own house in order, and this Victorian government has got to continue to make difficult decisions to rein in spending and address the ballooning level of debt, particularly as it looks like we're not going to see any upgrade to our ratings, and possibly even look at a further downgrading to our credit rating. So, this is something that some Commonwealth money is not going to fix, and it wouldn't be right to ask taxpayers in other states to bail out Victoria. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make, though, is that let's not forget, Victoria, less than 2 months ago, received a significant cash top-up from the Commonwealth Grants Commission, almost $4 billion, which, I think hasn't really made, based on yesterday's budget, made that much of an impact in terms of helping to solve the problem. But nonetheless, I think there is an issue about the way that Commonwealth money is doled out to the states, and the GST, which is collected by the states, is given back to them. And certainly I'm someone who's happy to see the relativity numbers getting closer to 1 to 1. But I don't think that Victoria has demonstrated, certainly not in yesterday's budget, that money that is being given as an extra top-up or effectively handout has solved the problem. So, from a federalist perspective and from the perspective of someone who cares about these issues, I think those are two issues. And I note that in yesterday's budget, 49% of revenue for Victoria has come in the form of money from the Commonwealth already. I mean, I think it points to a major systemic issue, John, that you and I have spoken about extensively in the past, and I think this budget just reinforces that.
I take that point, certainly. I didn't, I agree entirely on this, the problem of vertical fiscal imbalance, and the fact that less efficient states are able to be less efficient and then get bailed out for it. The reason Victoria got an increase in their GST, and I agree, them going closer to receiving a 1-for-1 is a good thing. It's a good result. But the reason Victoria got an increase in GST is because the mining heavy states were doing well in the mining sector. And so if those states run their mining sector well, Victoria, which I don't think has much of a mining sector, gets paid some of that benefit from the other states. And I understand that's the way a family or a local community would do it. One does well and they share. It doesn't necessarily go without saying that if one state does well, they should be forced to share, and if one does badly, everyone should be forced to bail them out. The states could just make better decisions.
Absolutely. And I just make the point as well, it's not just that some of those states, WA and Queensland in particular, coming to mind, have done better. It's also that Victoria has continued to do poorly. And that is one of the fundamental issues with the current policy of horizontal fiscal equalisation, that states that perform badly, that don't manage their budgets effectively, that don't look at how they can maintain the revenue that they need to fund the services that they need to deliver, get rewarded in a way because they get better relativity scores when the Grants Commission comes and looks at these things. So, I think Victoria got a $4 billion cash injection primarily because the government in Victoria has failed to manage things responsibly.
Yes, it is ridiculous incentive. By the way, some numbers here. I know this is a little bit difficult. You're watching faces and I give you numbers. I'm very aware of how much people's eyes glaze over when you get the numbers. So I'm going to round these numbers to some degree to make it a bit easier. The current budget deficit was reported. By the way, this is a headline figure. We should have let you know. They've reported that the budget deficit for this year is $2.2 billion. Now, I want to talk about whether that's true or not in a moment. But just for a second, last year, they said that this budget would have a $1 billion deficit. So it's gone from 1 to more than 2. All right. That's not totally outlandish, but consider this. They expected a $1 billion deficit. Then they got an extra $1.2 billion in GST. So straight away, they should have been in surplus. Then they got an extra $0.2 billion in higher taxes because they've increased taxes again, as you do. Then they got over $1 billion of what do you call, other variations, economic variations out of their control. Just good luck, right? They got good luck, gave them another $1 billion. And then they did, to their credit, 0.3 billion worth of savings. So that's the one tick I give this budget, by the way. Well, I'll give them 2 ticks. I'll get to the other one later. But yes, they did save three shillings and tuppence, or 0.3 billion. So you add all that together, they were only supposed to have a $1 billion deficit. And then they get an extra billion. Then they save an extra billion. Then they get an extra billion. And somehow that turns into an even bigger deficit. So what's missing? Well, even though they're in deficit and debt and they need to tighten their belt, and everyone's accused them of tightening their belt, the Victorian government has actually increased spending by $6 billion just in this year. Right? The media and the government have a nasty habit of bundling everything together in 4-year blocks. I just don't think that's how humans think. Maybe it's how politicians or journalists think, but I don't think it's how humans think. No offense, Xavier, because you just did the same thing there. But they just in 1 year, just talk about 1 year, because humans can, I think, normal people can conceptualize that. But it was the budget should have been in a $4 billion surplus based on previous estimates and then just everything that happened naturally, GST increase, other variations. It should have been a $4 billion surplus. Instead, it was a $2 billion deficit because they spent $6 billion just in this year on new projects. This isn't continuing projects. This isn't, you have to keep the schools open and the hospitals open. That's old money. This is new projects, $6 billion this 1 year. That is profligate. And they're talking about they've got to tighten their belts and they have to be responsible economic managers. Is that they should be in surplus. They could have been in surplus. They're not in surplus. And that's entirely their choice because they've spent this $6 billion. Anyway, enough of my ranting on that topic. Gene, I cut you off earlier. What did you want to jump in?
That's okay. Just a couple of things there. So you talking about the net operating balance, are you? Because if you're talking about that, then that $6 billion, that must be short-term stuff. That must be things like cost of living relief. It's not necessarily longer-term projects because that's the capital spending. So it's even more profligate. I mean, it's just just shows a complete lack of competence in managing public finances.
Well, that's the trick they've done here is the focus has been on saving money on the capital spend. And that has happened. And Barclay, you mentioned that before. I got to say, that's the second tick I give them. They were spending more than they had. When you're spending more than you have, spend less. Right. So the fact that they're spending less on the capital projects, I think is the responsible thing to do here. It was irresponsible of them to let the capital spend get so far away from their affordability in the first place. We can criticize them for that. But if they finally half come to their senses and do accidentally half a thing correct, we shouldn't criticize that part. Right. So good. They're being slightly more responsible on the capital side. But then that's what everyone's focused on. But on the recurrent expenditure side, 6 billion just in this year alone. I think it's another 4.5 next year, and over the 5 years, over the forward estimates, it adds up to over 20 billion. But 6 billion this year alone, I find eye-watering.
Yeah, just another observation, John. I think a lot of it, from what I see, is it comes down to a lot of their philosophy. So we saw during the Andrews government period that they kind of had, talking 2018 to 2022 and, maybe 1 or 2 years further, we basically saw this idea that for the lowest common denominator, we would shut down the entire economy to protect lives. And I think it's impossible to look at a budget, now, or even if it's 5 years' time, to not talk about the COVID period that the Andrews government went in. But more importantly, we've hashed on about that enough, even on our ATA Econ chats, how draconian the Andrews government was with COVID. But it's the whole response of, protection and public safety at all costs. So what do I mean by that? I was down in Victoria for the 2022 state election, and one of the big cornerstone policies that Daniel Andrew took to that election was the removal of 50 of the state's level crossings. Now you're probably thinking, well, hang on, we're talking about macro state issues here. Removing level crossings here and there, what's the big issue? Well, each one of those level crossings cost $160 million to remove. Now, you might say in 5 years from now, well, look, we saved, 5, 6, 7, 8 lives from happening that otherwise would have happened as the projections go, because, hey, we've all been around level crossings. They can be dangerous. But at a cost of $8.3 billion, of course, like with all government projects, they budgeted for $5 billion. It ended up being $8.3 billion. And John, as you pointed out, I know this $8.3 billion is being spent over a number of years, but they've already blown out by $2 billion to the budget, and that was when they already received so many concessions from the federal government. So it's this whole kind of approach of, at any cost, we must protect, the lowest common denominator. Like, I almost feel like, in 10 years from now, we'll see the state government of Victoria banning cars, or because we've got to keep people safe, and because if we ban cars, then we'll save road deaths. That is seemingly the track that we're heading down, is that, if anyone has the potential to be unsafe as a result, then it justifies excess spending, which also has the unintended consequences. We see, as a result of this budget, we see the delay in the extension of mental health benefits and mental health facilities being open. So, there are lives to be lost there in that respect as well. So it doesn't seem that like there's a weighing up of, I guess, economics versus public health or public safety here. Kind of the idea of fear-mongering us all into saying, well, they kept us safe. And, I think it's really important that we point that out. And it's not just red herrings. It's to the tune of $8.3 billion. We'll talk about those level crossings, John.
Yeah.
Well,
Mark, I think, I think what you're identifying is that for a while we were in this sort of dream world scenario where they thought the cost of money was cheap, they could borrow at very low rates, and they weren't really aware of this budget constraint. But this budget constraint is really starting to bite, and that's what Tim Pallas is dealing with. He's having to deal with this legacy of all of the excessive spending in the past, and this high interest bill, which is just compromising their ability to deliver services. And so it does come to bite you eventually. I mean, you may try and deny reality, but ultimately it's going to catch up with you.
That was another potential segue into the rant that I want to give that I know no one else cares about, which is about how to report budget balances. I will hold myself back. I'll withstand the temptation because I want to just go around the circle and ask you guys something that may be a little bit of a difficult question in this context. Can you think of anything nice to say about this budget? It's not too hard to find, the tax increases, the stupid spending, the debt and deficits. I agree with all that. But let's challenge ourselves now. I gave you two. They managed to shave 3 shillings and halfpenny off one spending program somewhere. And I think they've made more responsible capital spending decisions, vaguely more responsible. And you guys, is there anything else in there to give half a tick? Do you agree or disagree with me? Are you saying I'm already being too generous? Go ahead. Sorry, Gene, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go because I think we chatted about this pre-show. I like their commercial and industrial property tax reform. That's in box 1.2 on page 13 of the main budget document, where they're saying that properties that are sold from 1 July 2024 will pay stamp duty one last time. After that, stamp duty on the property will be replaced with a more efficient commercial and industrial property tax. And I think, most economists would say that's probably a better way to do it. There are a lot of concerns about stamp duty and what that means for the efficient use of properties. Arguably, it'd be good to do that for residential property, but that becomes very politically difficult. But I think that's potentially one measure where, hey, they've probably, seen some reason. But then again, they're probably doing it for budgetary reasons to bring forward a lot of revenue. Perhaps it's in their financial interest, but generally I think that's the sort of thing that could get a tick. But I might have a closer look at that. But superficially, it looks like a good move.
Just to clarify that, they don't bring forward revenue. What they actually do is they push back revenue by switching from a stamp duty to the land tax. So there is a tax cut in here. I think it's like about 0.2, 0.3 $billion value, which is offset by the other tax increases, as we mentioned. There's two tax increases and one tax cut in this budget, adding up to a tax increase in terms of revenue. But that was the tax cut. It does actually decrease revenue slightly. They start clawing it back in far out into the future, but any government that makes a decision that benefits them far off in the future is already being far more responsible than most politicians I've heard of lately. So I think you're probably right that they can get at least half a tick for that one. Xavier, can I put you on the spot here? This is probably not your natural environment, finding something nice to say about the Victorian Labor government, but can you do it?
Well, look, I agree. I'm in favour of any tax cut, even if in this instance has been offset by other tax increases. But the other two things I'd point to, I mentioned before, the size of government is going to continue to grow, but it's going to grow at a slightly slower rate. And I think, that's a sign that they are at least looking at making some difficult and responsible decisions. So, the size of government is going to grow less slowly than they expect GSP to grow. So, in GSP terms, it's a cut to the size of government. So, I think still a lot more to do, but, I give half a tick for that. And I suppose the other thing is, there have been cuts. I'm not sure, and I have to confess, had the chance to really consider all of them, but there have been significant cuts to a lot of service delivery as well. Now, some of those cuts, I think will hurt a lot of people and are not necessarily the right cuts, but at least it does demonstrate that they are trying to make difficult decisions. And ultimately, that's what government is about. It is about making decisions, and often they have to be difficult. So I think that's something which, again, maybe half a tick for at least trying to make some difficult decisions in this budget. Whether they're the right ones or not, I'll leave to others.
Yeah, I did hear quite a bit about the cruel cuts being introduced, and so I went hunting for them through the budget, and I found amongst about 100 pages just of outlining new spend, et cetera. It was more painful for me. I had to read them all. Eventually, I got to one single page that said, we've trimmed these and it's going to save us 0.2 billion. Kudos, better than nothing. But I'm not sure if it's a slash and burn. I know the ABC will declare it that, because the ABC says if you're only doubling government spending, it's a slash and burn because you should triple it. But I don't think in reality it's a slash and burn. But yes, you make a good point in terms of, by the way, when Xavier says GSP, he's not saying GST with a lisp. It's GSP, gross state product. If you've heard of GDP, talking about the total size of the economy of a country, GDP, gross domestic profit, that product, that's how much is produced in the country every year. GSP, how much is produced in the state every year. So GSP is the correct variable to use as the denominator when you're working out a percentage. And Xavier was very right. Government spending is going to, hopefully, if they keep to their forecasts, which is a big if. I don't know how religious you guys are, but it might take some praying. If they keep to their forecasts, government spending is going to increase, not decrease, ABC. Notice this. It's going to increase by slightly less than GSP will, which means the spending as a percentage of GSP will go down. That's not true for tax, though. It's worth noting that the tax is still going to grow at about 4 to 5%. GSP won't grow at that same level. So the tax is going to grow in real per capita terms, which is, I think, the correct measure, and in percentage of GSP terms. And that's why they're hoping to get to a mythical surplus sometime in the distant future, once we're all grandparents. But yes, having said all that, I'm sounding very negative now. I'm falling for my own trick here. But Xavier's very right. They have at least budgeted to not increase spending by as much as they otherwise would in the out years. So half a tick there. All right, Barclay, this is going to be tough on you. Give us something. Can you find anything positive to say that we haven't said, or are you going to just disagree with us all?
No, I think there is something positive for the Allen government, and I think it's because it does feel as though we're finally transitioning away from those what you'd like to think was temporary COVID era policies, and I'm talking about the paid sick leave for casual workers. Now, often anyone who's worked part-time versus casual jobs in their early 20s, such as myself, we are familiar with the fact that if you work casual, you get a higher pay, but it doesn't come with the same benefits that you get for sick leave and whatnot. But that distinction was completely overridden by the Allen, or at that time, the Andrews government, and it was continued for a period, but now it's finally been drawn to a close. And I think that cost the Victorian taxpayer $250 million. With the government subsidising, casual workers. Now, the nature of casual work, often for a lot of people in the gig economy, that kind of thing, it's not conducive to sick leave. That is why we have part-time work, and that is why people work part-time and they're able to apply for that kind of sick leave and their entitlements. So for them to completely remove that distinction, I think ignores the nature of how we're employed, particularly in the modern day. And I think it's a broader reflection of what the Albanese government's doing in the space of the gig economy. By not acknowledging that the nature of people who drive, who do Uber driving, who do DoorDash delivery, these kind of things, is completely different in nature to someone who's a part-time or a full-time worker. So I think it's good, and I think it will be good, a good saving measure. But again, we're talking $250 million, which sounds like a lot to the average punter, but in the scheme of things, this is a state that should have been $4 to $5 billion in surplus, even with those federal government concessions, and now they've somehow managed to pluck a $2 billion deficit. So, yeah, if there was any kind of silver lining, John, that'd probably be the one that I take out of it. It seems that we've finally transitioned out of the COVID era mania. So,
all right, we all managed to say something nice. Having said that, Wait, just before we go on to the next thing, I do believe Xavier's running out of time. So just before he had to just drop off randomly, and it looks like he was angry at us, I thought I'd throw to him one last time for any concluding comments, or I forced you to be nice about the Labor government. Feel free to change course now. Any final thoughts on this before you have to run off?
Well, look, thanks, John. And as I said before, thanks again for the invitation. And hopefully I will see you and many others from the ATA at our conference in a couple of weeks on the Gold Coast. I think probably my final thought, and it sort of comes back to where I started, is that there's a lot wrong with this budget. I hope that when we come to next week's federal budget, that the federal government hasn't decided to come in and try and help Victoria out of some of its problems. I think Victoria has got to sort its own house out. And I hope that this can at least spark a bit of a longer-term conversation about systemic reform, particularly, as I said before, the GST, the policy of HFE, I think, has got to go. And there is a broader and more difficult challenge of VFI to solve. And I hope the ATA continues to be part of that conversation, as the Samuel Griffith Society will be.
And hopefully at some stage, then I'll convince you that we need to abolish the federal income tax and have the states run income tax, and then that'll fix our VFI. But that's probably we need a whole other live stream for that.
Sounds good, John. And thanks, Jane. And thanks for the discussion today.
Mate.
Thanks a lot for coming in, Xavier.
John, can I just acknowledge, I think Ash Blackwell in the comments has made a great point. This is something I wasn't aware of. So I was trying to be positive. I find one positive thing in the budget, and I saw the box on that property tax reform and wasn't aware that it was actually from last time. So I was giving them credit for something that they've already announced. So I think that's quite a good point. So there's actually less in this budget that is positive than I imagined.
We were supposed to be doing the positive thing here, Gene. Anyway,
oh, I know, but I thought that was a positive from this budget, but apparently they've just reheated it. It was from last budget.
Ash, if you're still around and you feel like it, if you've got pants on, feel free to come and join us in this live stream. I guess you don't have to have pants for a live stream. If you've got a shirt on, feel free to come and join us in the live stream and tell us what we're missing. The three of us, Barclay, Gene, and myself, all being dirty cane toads, so Queenslanders up north. So we one other comment here I thought was worth sharing. Melissa, can people not end up paying more with property tax versus stamp duty? Yes, it is possible. Firstly, depends what level you set the stamp duty and the property tax at, right? I mean, it's possible that either could be bigger as revenue raises. It just depends on the level you set it. Secondly, for individuals, if you're swapping houses regularly, then stamp duty is going to clearly be worse for you because you're paying stamp duty, which is a much larger tax that you pay less often. But if you move house a lot, you're paying it quite often. If you stay in one house and you never move, then you'd have been better off with stamp duty because land tax you keep paying, right? So if say 10 years of land tax is equal one lot of stamp duty, if you move house more than once every 10 years, you'd prefer land tax. If less than once every 10 years, you'd prefer stamp duty. That's roughly the, I mean, I just made up the 10-year number. Keep that in mind, but that's the logic behind it. But the comment at the end is one that everyone could probably pause and dwell on. How about we scrap stamp duty and replace it with nothing? So that's, of course, the difficulty there is the government has three primary sources. The state government has three primary sources of tax revenue, being payroll tax, stamp duty, and the land tax. The land tax that you pay if you're a landlord and you own lots of land. So there's not many other options for them because the High Court has ruled that it's unconstitutional for them to do anything else. But it is. I think it would be possible to find ways to reform spending projects in a way that brings long-term spending pressure down and allows you to start at least drastically cutting, if not abolishing, some of those taxes, especially if they're going to keep living off the GST welfare that they get handed to them by Canberra. I forced you guys to all be a little bit positive in that. What from this budget do you think has been missed? You would have seen the standard talking heads on TV or the newspapers. Do you think is there anything that you looked through here that you thought was the wrong priorities? While you guys do that, I'm going to try and set up the Zoom room so that the riffraff, the hoi polloi, everyone else that isn't us is able to sneak in here and yell at us. So you guys take it away.
You want to start, Gene?
Right. I suppose. I mean, to me, it just looks like they are waking up to reality. I mean, I have some skepticism about whether they'll be able to keep that net debt to GSP at around 25%. So they are trying to roughly stabilize it. I mean, we have to, given the deteriorations we've seen in the past, we have to wonder how reliable those estimates are. But look, I mean, yeah, it's just these budgets. I mean, there's so many different areas of spending. It's hard to, come up. You need a few days to really go through it all. So at the moment, I can't say I've got, any great insights beyond what we've talked about already. What do you think, Barclay? Anything?
Well, I think, as someone with, family down in Victoria, it's you see it on the bumper sticker or on the number plates of every single car. It's the education state. And I really do think that, it's something that the ATA has talked about and piloted before in terms of what this budget could have done. In times when, the state government spending on education is just growing exorbitantly out of control, I think something like a private school voucher scheme would be fantastic to pilot in Victoria. I think that would be a fantastic kind of initiative that you'd look to do because, obviously it's got difficulties in perhaps more regional and remote areas where it's maybe a little hard to go to your next closest school. But in a place like Victoria, whereby, something like 70 to 80% of the population do live in Melbourne, I would have thought that would be one of the best states where you're able to pilot a program like that. And in times when they really are headed toward economic ruin, something like private school vouchers whereby, the money that the parent would ordinarily spend, or the government would ordinarily spend sending their kid to a state school, $5,000 to $6,000, let's say, instead is given to the parent in the form of a voucher towards going to the local private school. Now, again, it's a cliche, of course, everyone knows Victoria is the education state, and they still are a leader in that space. But they're not going to be for much longer if they keep heading down this road of economic ruin and further handouts. I think it's $400 for every state school attended. So I think instead of, allowing, I guess, more of the same and continual growth of the state school system, which really is, even in Victoria and in my home state of Queensland, bursting at the seams. I think it'd be really, I think it'd be a great thing that they could try perhaps in a future budget to look at something like private school vouchers. Maybe that's a bit left field to what we were discussing, but I think it's topical and I think it'd be the place that it would work out of anywhere else. So, it'd be interesting to see. I think it's hard to find any criticisms of that system. I'm sure there will be some that can maybe jump on in the comments. But I do see that as something that could have been missed.
Yeah. One other, just on some of the, trying to find other positive things in the budget. I mean, just looking at that ABC site that you identified before, Barclay, I found that too. I think that's really useful. It's got some, identifies some things that they're doing, which you could say, okay, look, that's probably a good idea. That's warranted. I mean, they're investing more in the safety of women and children, so additional money there. So, fair enough. That's probably necessary. I guess one thing I would point out as a Queensland, like we're Queenslanders, and what I find fascinating about all this is for, half a decade or maybe a bit longer, Queensland, probably about a decade, Queensland was the worst in Australia. We had the most debt, and we were seen as the state which had mismanaged things. But now we've got Victoria and New South Wales to a lesser extent setting a new bad standard. And so that's creating an excuse for Queensland government to try and get away with a few more things with massive cost of living relief that's arguably unaffordable. So I think, it's just interesting how the bad behaviour of one state can have this effect on other states by setting a poor example. And there's this bigger question, and we were talking about potential, Judith Sloan the other day was talking about the risk of, the federal government may have to bail them out. I mean, we'll have to see what exactly that involves. It might involve a guarantee of state borrowing to some extent, where they put the federal government stamp on the bonds issued by Victoria so they can borrow at a lower rate. Perhaps that's how it'll start off. I mean, I think I wouldn't agree with that, but who knows what's going to happen. There's just there's that underlying problem of vertical fiscal imbalance, which creates that blurring of accountabilities, and according to IMF research, does actually lead to higher debt at the subnational level. And I think this is something we're seeing. They know that potentially the Commonwealth can bail them out, and so there's just not that level of responsibility there needs to be.
If you don't hold people responsible, they act less responsible. That one's it's hard to see coming. Sorry, Barclay, did you have I was going to come in with some more.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a brief question. I mean, I think it was just poignant there, because you did have that comparison of governments there, Gene. And I suppose, a question that maybe the audience might be interested in I guess, having a say on, or be interested in hearing both of your opinions on, is how can we compare the Allen government and the Andrews government? Is it simply a continuation of the same, or has there not been long enough for us to, work out, okay, which direction is Allen going to take the Victorian state government in? Is it an improvement? Is it, more of the same? Is she even worse than Daniel Andrews? Because a lot of people listening on this call, they might not even know who the current Premier of Victoria is, Jacinta Allen. And they don't know, is she just as bad? Where is she from? Is she from the same group in the Labor Party? So, is there enough to go off, gents, that we see so far of, is this going to be a turning point for Victoria, or more of the same?
This is, it's a bit early, and what is that feedback? All right. It's a bit early, and it might be getting into more politics than economics, but my impression here is that Jacinta's, the government, right, the new Victorian government, they haven't introduced big new tax increases. They haven't introduced massively unaffordable new capital projects that look big and fancy and make a good announcement and just aren't affordable. They've tried to wind back some of that previous overspend, and they've tried to avoid increasing taxes. So this feels to me like a very stock standard, don't know what to do. They're not trying to be irresponsible. I think Dan basically just gave up trying to be irresponsible. I think he didn't care. I think the whole attitude that they've taken going into this budget reminds me of someone who suddenly realized, wait, unsustainable debt is bad. They've got to that realization. They just haven't yet worked out that means they need to change behavior, right? They haven't worked out what to do to fully get it under control. But look, their realization is a good first step, because it didn't seem to me that Dan even had that. So very early, but it's hard to get worse than Dan.
They're taking baby steps. They're at baby step one in terms of fixing the problem. Really, I mean, I think they recognise that there's a problem, and they've tried to do a few little things. And I guess, I mean, you did identify they have delayed some of their big projects, so that would have hurt them. I mean, the reality is they were just handed such terrible projects from the previous government without proper cost-benefit analyses. You know, what was that ridiculous suburban rail loop, $100 billion or something? Just madness.
Yeah. Well, I think it's actually quite hilarious because a lot of people, you know, maybe from out of state or perhaps they don't follow politics too closely, they're thinking, where has this Jacinta Allen come from? Like they kind of knew that Daniel Andrews is gone, but they haven't heard anything about, you know, his replacement because there's no memes like there was about Daniel Andrews every day in the Australian. But the irony, I have to point it out, you know, Jacinta Allen's track record prior to getting into government, becoming the premier, was she was the Minister for the Delivery of the Commonwealth Games. And so she was in a ministerial portfolio and paid a separate additional wage to deliver something which she was responsible for completely getting rid of and tarnishing and costing Victorians money. So and now it looks like she's, you know, put a fork in the suburban rail loop at least for another 4 years. So maybe she's the closer of all capital projects and big projects that Daniel Andrews wanted to do. So maybe she's a libertarian we never knew. So
look, I got to say on the Commonwealth Games, and this is not smart politics what I'm about to say, but the mistake was the original spend. Right? There's the sunk cost fallacy. If you make a mistake with an original spend, you don't double down and make twice as big a mistake next week just to justify your old mistake. So they're given a lot of crap for cutting that project. They should have. They should never have done it in the first place. But if you inherited that government, right? If you inherited that situation and you had a choice, someone before me made a bad decision. Should I make a bigger bad decision to justify their bad decision? Or should I cut it? They deserve the flack for their original irresponsible spending decisions. We should probably show some understanding when they change direction, because if you never reward changing direction, then politicians have no incentive to ever change direction. So that one extra tick for somebody, I don't know who it was who made the decision. Was it Jacinta? There you go.
I think Dan, maybe it was, but Dan Andrews announced it. I think she must have been alongside him, if I remember the press conference. Just on the taxes and charges point, John, I think there was one increase, wasn't there? They put up there's this state fire services property levy, so they've increased that to an extent. So there are some losers, but you're right. There's not like you were saying that you didn't see the big tax increases you might have expected if they were trying to get this under control. Yeah.
So there were 2 tax increases, 1 tax cut, and it added up to a tax increase of 0.3 billion. But we're talking about debt of 200 billion. We're talking about deficits in the billions. Look, I'd still prefer they not have those tax increases, but compared to the size of Dan Andrews' tax increases, this was, I mean, it seems like a strange thing to say. It's like, I'm only getting tortured instead of killed. It's like, it's not, that doesn't make it a good thing, but it's less bad than what some of the previous years have been. That was my point there. We've got a few more comments coming in. Dan might have got re-elected if he had a chance. Well, I'm just going to take that straight off there, Rick. I'm not going to let people see that. That's a horrible thing to say to us.
I just wanted to jump in there. And I think it's a bit, maybe it's the eternal pessimist in me. But to me, you can judge a lot by the opposition based on the issues or the budget reply that they give in response to this budget. Now, I know, as I understand it, the budget reply hasn't yet been given yet by Victorian opposition leader John Pesutto. But to my mind, it's what he takes from this budget where we can see, okay, well, if there was an alternative and we weren't to re-elect the Allen government in 2026, what would be the change? And to my mind, it's actually quite negative in the sense that, you know, John Pesutto is going to come out in this budget reply speech, I guarantee, and say this is a disgrace. This is a government full of cuts. This is a government full of closed projects. This is a government who hasn't given apt focus and apt money to mental health services. They've paused them all. And to my mind, he should be talking more about the cost of living pressures that have been increased. So things like the fact that ratepayers are going to pay more, the fact that there is a vacancy levy, these kind of things, because it seems to me that the right of politics, in this case, every opposition leader in Australia, because the Liberal Party are in opposition in every state, it seems to me that they need to make the idea of cuts more sexy if they truly are to prevail and we truly are to see a rewriting of, I guess, because we have to be completely honest in saying that it's been Liberal governments federally and also at a state level in previous years that have presided over massive budget deficits and running up state debt as well. And it's because they've drunk this mantra of, maybe it's to a slightly lesser degree than Labor, but they've drunk this mantra that we can't possibly say a cut because we'll be demonised by the other side. In my home state of Queensland, my goodness, the left still trot out the line of cuts and chaos from the Newman era, which from 2012 to 2015. So it really does need to be, if we truly are to see more prolonged, budget surpluses on a state and a federal level, it does appear like we need to change the narrative. Instead of it being called a cut, maybe call it a saving, that kind of thing. And I know this is, just maybe my 2 cents worth, and there's a lot more research that probably goes into these kind of things in political jargon and political slogans for right of centre parties to reclaim the narrative in favour of being more fiscally conservative. But it doesn't feel like it would be any different under the opposition, I feel, or it'll be slightly better. I'm not sure.
I think the state Liberal parties have established themselves as being slightly more competent managers of roughly the same drift towards ever bigger government. And
Yes.
look, if you had to have bigger government, I'd like it to be slightly better managed. So I guess that's I mean, you end up through compulsory preferential voting. Normally you end up having to pick one of them. And if one of them is drifting towards big government and doing it happily and badly, and the other one is drifting to big government and doing it grudgingly and a bit more competently, I'm still very depressed by the fact that these are the 2 choices we've got. But if they do it more competently, that's one thing. I agree. I think that one of the concerns, one of the issues we've got to look at there is if Pseudo responds to this budget in the way that we suspect he might, I don't know if it's going to be driven so much by the Labor Party as by the media, the left-wing media. And it seems to me an inexplicable need amongst Liberal Party politicians to try and be liked by journalists that will never like them. And no matter what they do, Labor will offer to spend $3 more, and all of the journalists will say, oh, well, Labor's still the better option. I don't know what they're trying to achieve. And it's got the country on the wrong track. Where's the political courage to actually say, look, I understand the ABC might not like me, but this is what's right for Australia. This is what's right for Victoria. This is what's right for the people going forward. I might have to take a few slings and arrows, and that's okay because I can fight back. But political courage is the thing that's sorely missing, not just in Victoria or Australia. It seems worldwide. It is the premium. I think I'm going to get the person saying this wrong. It's Elon Musk or someone like that. Say that the thing that we're in short supply of now isn't genius, it's courage. You need both. But we've got lots of geniuses. We just have not enough courageous people willing to try and do the right thing. Gene, I interrupted you.
Oh, it's okay. I just wanted to pick up on something that Barclay was saying. I wouldn't necessarily see this as a Labor versus Liberal thing. And I think John's point is, look, maybe one side is historically, on average, more likely to be, have worse fiscal policy than the other. Okay, there's possibly some evidence of that, but there have been responsible Labor governments in the past. You've had the Goss government here in Queensland and the early days of the Beattie government with McEnroth as treasurer. You had the Hawke-Keating government. So it's not necessarily to do with the colour of the government. It's got to do with how sensible the people who are running the government are. And I think there's just been too much of this whole we got into this era where we thought interest rates are going to be low forever, the secular stagnation type of idea. And then we've got all of these wacky modern monetary theory ideas where debt doesn't matter, deficits and debts, that's just all neoliberal right-wing sort of their talking points. So let's just, we can just spend whatever we want, borrow to build. And what we're learning now is, look, there was some, people who are accused of that, such as myself, were making some good points. So that's what we're learning.
I think the MMT theory says print to build. But they don't need to borrow because they just print all the money they need.
Well, yeah, you could, yeah.
Gents, if I may indulge you guys, there was one rant that I hinted that I wanted to make earlier that I still want to get around to saying at some point. And it is a bit boffiny, so please join me with your pointy hats, people. But this goes to do with how we report the budget balance. And I think these things matter. I think they matter hugely to the politics downstream. And the left has been very good at framing the language. And it always seems like such a boring topic, framing the language, that we don't bother doing it or discussing it. They get away with it. And then the policy ends up following what's logical, what's implicit in the language. So the government announced they had a budget deficit of $2.2 billion. They also announced they had a cash operating surplus of $1.8 billion. That number is meaningless, but they were able to trot it out and have the media report that, look, they've got this nice, shiny, better number, and they have for a couple of years. And this is the trick about deciding which of these numbers matter, because the truth is neither of them do. They are both they are both the wrong metric to be judging a budget by. So these are the operating balances, which means these balances, either of those ones we just picked, right? The 2.2 billion, let's stick with that. The 2.2 billion operating balance in deficit looks at all of the recurrent spending and all the recurrent revenue, and it ignores all the capital spending. And this capital spending often isn't profitable. Most of it isn't financially profitable. Much of it probably isn't even just profitable for anyone. You don't get a return on it, and yet you do have to pay for it. And when you buy that capital, you buy those capital goods, you still have to use money to buy it. Where does the money come from? You still have to borrow it. People may notice sometimes state governments say, yes, good news, we have a surplus. Unfortunately, the debt's going up. Wait, what?
Yeah.
Well, that's because the surplus isn't actually measuring the spending and the revenue from the government. Now, here's the trick. The federal government does this close to correctly. Probably is, look, no number's going to be perfect. The numbers used by the federal government are probably the best numbers you could use. They use the underlying cash balance and the fiscal balance. They're often very similar. It's just a bit of a timing issue. That's fine. Use both. Use either. Now, that's roughly correct because that includes spending on non-financial assets, non-financial capital. Now, that's what the federal government uses. If we did that, if we use the federal government's number, they normally use the underlying cash balance. So the government says we've got a $2 billion deficit and we'll fix it next year. That sounds fine. That sounds mild. No one really pays attention. The truth is Victoria has a $15.2 billion underlying cash deficit. That is what, I can't do that math quickly off the top of my head. What's that? 800% more than they're admitting. The current deficit is huge and no one's admitting it. No one's reporting it because the journalists, they got no incentive to try and talk about being more fiscally responsible because you'd have to decrease spending. But they also don't understand this. So the government just says, oh, operating balance is this. The media reports it. Everyone talks about it. And as soon as they get that operating balance close to balanced, they don't make any more hard decisions. Right? You'll notice in the future, once they get the operating balance close to zero, if it's going to keep improving, then they add new spending projects. They don't bother letting that improve any further because they're focused on that operating balance. Once it's positive, they think they're home and clear. If they're actually focused on the underlying cash balance or the fiscal balance, they know they've still got lots of work to do. Right? Even if they didn't spend the $6 billion, the new spending they did this year, which they shouldn't have. I said before, they announced a $2 billion deficit. It would have been a $4 billion surplus if they'd just been responsible and just sat on their hands for 1 year. But the truth is, it's a $15 billion underlying cash deficit. Even pocketing that, it would still be a $9 billion budget deficit. Right? They need to have much stricter savings. And no one's noticing that because no one's reporting the correct budget balance. Anyway, end of my rant. Thoughts on that, gents?
Well, I think, John, okay, a few things. So, I mean, you're right. I mean, the bulk of the capital spending is not affecting the operating balance, but the depreciation does. So it's the net spending on capital assets that adds on to that subtracts from that net operating balance to give you the fiscal balance, or what they call, that's like what we would think of as, what the balance you should be looking at, because that's the one that's going to more closely correlate with debt.
Well, if I may just quickly, that's the difference between when they report they've got a $1.8 billion cash operating balance. Yeah. That doesn't include the depreciation. Either. Right. Yeah. Yes, but the fiscal operating balance does include the depreciation, and that's one step forward. But the truth is, they're also actually spending actual money on actual capital. Yeah.
And so the way I would think of it is that, that operating surplus, like having an operating balance, that's a basic requirement. That's like a necessary condition for fiscal sustainability over time, to have that, because otherwise you're violating that golden rule of fiscal policy. If you're borrowing to pay wages and keep the lights on, so to speak, then you're in a whole world of pain. So on average, you should be running an operating balance or operating surplus, so then you can really make a contribution to that capital spend. And I guess the way they think about it is that, well, I mean, the capital spending helps us expand the economy and that the revenue will come back to the government. The problem is, as we know, a lot of this spending is pretty rubbish, or it's not really that great, as you're suggesting, and it doesn't really yield that return to the budget that would actually help pay for it. And the way that this ends up causing trouble for them is eventually they borrow so much that interest bill increases so much that it starts affecting their ability to spend on health and education or police services. So there is a check ultimately, but I think for the problem is if you're not looking at this budget balance, then you can get lulled into a false sense of security, let that fiscal deficit get out of control, you build up enough debt, and then suddenly, I've got this massive interest bill. What's going on?
Yeah. Look, I take your point. It is true. That's the argument they make. They say no, investment has a return, and because it has a return, this could be good debt. But notice the federal government has the exact same argument, but they still report it more honestly. So why not report it more honestly? And just because I say, hey, if I borrow this money to make a good investment, then when I do my family accounts, I should just pretend I didn't borrow the money. I mean, that wouldn't be a very good way for me to tell my wife how the budget is going that year, right? We should factor it all. The other thing to note here is the use of the word investment. The government uses it for every piece of spending, right? We're investing in mowing the lawn. We're investing in, giving kids a day off school so they can feel better. Everything is called investment. That's because the word investment has positive connotations. But nearly nothing the government does would actually fall into the category of the sort of investment you wouldn't include in your budget, right? Because if you want to include it in your budget, financially, it needs to be an investment that has a financial return that you're going to see and be able to pay for itself. Most government spending doesn't even try to do that. And then they make the more abstract argument. And I know the people sitting at home, I'm aware of this argument. It's just bullshit. They say, oh no, that we're making an investment that is just going to lift up productivity of everyone. So we're investing in education. Oh, really? What rate of return are you getting? Oh, zero. No, zero rate of return. But we're investing in education. And then when people are more educated, everyone will just get richer. And because we're richer, we'll all pay more tax. We could check that. That's an empirical question. We can measure it, the productivity level, right? Ever since governments, as they increase the amount they are investing in productivity goes down, or the rate of productivity increase. Productivity has paused in Australia. It has not gone up for 8 years. So we could look at this empirically. They're making the case that they need to not honestly report on their spending because it might magically trigger the productivity fairy, but it doesn't. So, I mean, again, just report it honestly. And then if you have a massive deficit, you can say, oh, I can justify it because my investment in lesbian dance theory is going to have a big payoff in the future. And you can just say that. And if people believe you, they might tolerate your deficit. And if they don't believe you, then they shouldn't tolerate your deficit. But we should at least know that deficit exists. 15 billion. Have you heard anyone talking about it? Nearly all the reporting on this budget has not been about the budget balance.
Yeah, you're right, John. Absolutely right. Before we wrap up, should we answer there's a great question that's come in from Enmity. Can you rate how screwed Victoria is from 1 to 10 being Argentina prior to Malay? Well, I mean, we're a long way from Argentina. Maybe, if they continued on, the silly path they're on, maybe. But look, they at least don't have the printing press, do they? So the difference with the Argentina was, well, the federal government might, but the state government can't.
Sorry, Victoria. Yeah,
all right. You know what I mean? So the problem you've got in Latin America is that these governments end up turning on the printing press to pay their bills, and you end up in hyperinflation. So that's not possible in Victoria. It had stopped before then, unless they were conspiring with a sympathetic federal government. So, I think I'd say maybe we're 7 or 8. I mean, we're nowhere near. I don't think you can say we're on the same path as Argentina, but it's pretty bad compared to where we should be. I mean, we're an advanced economy. We've traditionally had very sound public finances. We're one of the few countries nationally with a AAA credit rating. This is really poor form. So maybe. Yeah, I don't know whether we compare relative to Argentina. Definitely a 7 or 8 maybe in terms of how bad it is, but how to compare it with Argentina, that's a difficult one.
So I know, Barclay, you probably have something to say there. There's 2 things I need to riff on that.
Yeah.
One is you say we're an advanced economy. So was Argentina, and until they started down this path. Right? And that's how they got to this situation. They started like us, made the bad decisions we're making now, It ended up where we say, oh, well, they're not an advanced economy. Yeah, that's a good reason we shouldn't copy them. And then, look, I take your point. We're not in the same place as them. But I disagree with you when you say we're not on the same path as them. I think this is what the path looks like. We're on a different place in the path. We're earlier in the path.
Yeah, okay.
We're still in the part of the path where someone still pulls out the weeds. But we're on that path. And I'm not so much worried about the current debt position as I am. And I've said this a lot of times. You guys have both heard me say it before. It's not the current debt level. It's the debt trajectory. Because I don't see who's going to show up with the political courage to put us on a different trajectory. And if you don't change trajectory, then this is that path. If I can indulge you a little bit longer with this, an analogy, you're coming up to a debt cliff. You're not near the debt cliff yet, so you're fine. But there is a debt cliff. And if you eventually fall off the debt cliff, there is a debt crisis, financial crisis, and economic crisis. It's a bad outcome. You're Greece from a few years ago, or Argentina now, right? So you don't want to get there. And you say, oh, well, I'm not near the cliff, so I should keep walking towards it. Well, that's a little bit dangerous because we don't actually know where the cliff's edge is. Like, it's not like we know, oh, as soon as the national debt to GDP ratio gets to 105%, then 104% we're fine, 105% the country falls apart. We don't know where it is. It's different for different countries. It depends on a lot of other variables. So we're walking towards a debt cliff. If I continue with that analogy, we're walking blindfolded. So you don't know where the cliff is. You think, oh, look, I'm probably not next to it. I'll take another step. All right, yeah, you're probably not next to it. How many blindfolded steps do you want to take? It gets worse, to continue with the analogy. It's you don't have complete control, right? The argument goes, oh, we can just keep racking up debt, and once it actually gets dangerous, we'll just stop, turn around and go another direction. Firstly, I doubt there's going to be anyone with the political courage to do it, but also you don't have that minuter control over debt, right? Your actions don't perfectly spin the economy on a dime. So you're walking towards a debt cliff, blindfolded and drunk. That's not a safe way to go about doing fiscal policy. We should probably, yes, we're probably not at the debt cliff. We're not in a disaster yet. I'd like to stay not in a disaster. That's why we need to stop walking that way. So anyway, Barclay, what do you think?
Largely, John. Could you give it a score from how screwed Victoria is from 1 to 10?
Oh, Victoria, 4, because I think it's the Australian government that's screwed, because I think there's an implicit federal government bailout that'll happen.
Yeah.
I think everyone acts according to that, and I think that's encourages bad behavior. I think the Fed should come out. I don't know if they can write a law or a constitutional amendment that says we can't bail you out, because that would lead to better behavior at the state level, and then one state could just ruin itself instead of ruin the country. I think federally we're on it's more of a slow motion walk, but that's what I worry about, because I think realistically, when you talk about the debt position of Australia, you need to include the debt position of the states, because they're eventually going to be taken on by the federal government. So the short-term state government, look, it's not good policy, what they've been doing, but I don't think we're near a disaster yet. As I said before, I'm not Chicken Little saying a disaster is here now, but I'm saying, can we please stop walking that direction? Because there's nothing fun at the end of that road.
If I can add maybe more of an objective metric, I think like if we talk about debt as a percentage of in Victoria's case gross state product, but in a federal government GDP, Argentina at the time when Milei took over was 46% debt as a proportion of GDP, and I think Victoria is roughly at around half of that, maybe slightly more than half of that. I think they're about 26%. So my 2 cents worth, I think they're probably at about 5.5. If we have, Argentina prior to Milei at a 10, Victoria's probably at a 5.5. And I think, John, you hit the nail on the head that I think, it does, morph more into a federal government problem with these bailouts that are happening, and also the other reckless spending that we're hopefully going to cover when we cover the federal budget in about a week's time. So I'm looking forward to that as well.
Yeah, a couple of quick comments. Firstly, Alan Moran's. You guys getting that background noise? Is that me or is that Barclay's dog, or what's happening there? Anyway, I need better technology. Sorry, a comment here. Alan Moran wrote that the last time Victoria tried to commit economic suicide, they had 16% debt as a percentage of GSP, and it's higher now. That's a good point. And well, it's going to be 25%, by the way, at the end of the Ford estimate. So that's by the year 2028. That's what the budget says. If you believe the budget. Can I just point out that just like I had a big rant before about operating balance is the wrong measure, it should be underlying cash balance or fiscal balance. Net debt's the wrong measure. Net debt doesn't factor in all of the money the government owes. it only factors in the money the government owes in one specific way, borrowing. And yes, you have to repay borrowing. That matters. What about all the superannuation liabilities? What about the unpaid creditors? I mean, the government owes a bunch of money. It's called the liabilities. That's what we should look at. So the correct measure of their financial position is net financial liabilities. Net financial liabilities, which is like net debt, but it factors in all of the liabilities the government has. And that, instead of going to 25% by the end of the Ford estimates, is actually over 31%. So again, it doesn't change the world, but if one side of the argument is able to control the narrative to make things look better or worse than they are just by the nature of the language we use, that ends up being very powerful. And I think at some stage we need to stop allowing the left or the enemies of Western civilization to be able to control how we talk about each topic as we talk about them, and push back a little bit and say, you know what, you think 25% is bad? It's already 31%. Or actually, well, that's at the end of the Ford estimates. It's already 27%. 27. Net financial liabilities are already 27.4% of GSP. So that's another little tidbit on that. And thank you for that comment, Alan. Alan also makes the same point we were making before. Where is the next Kennett? I don't know if there are many Kennetts floating around in state politics. Bravery is in short supply. I appreciate it when I see it. Where do we see it these days? I often, well, not often, I sometimes disagree with her. And I didn't join her party, but I think Pauline Hanson has bravery. Alex Antic seems like a person who's willing to consistently say things that you're not, quote unquote, allowed to say, which indicates a degree of either foolhardiness or bravery. But they're in short supply, especially amongst leaders. So where is the Kennett?
I will say that on a Victorian state parliamentary level, I know there's a number of, ex-IPA alumni in the state parliamentary team for the Liberal Party there. Evan Mulholland, I know he's someone who's often spoken about in Victoria as kind of like, oh, he's one of the good guys. It'd be fantastic to see someone like him, go into more of a leadership role, maybe, if they do ever get elected to the Victorian Liberal Party to maybe have some more fiscal conservatism in power. But I know you guys have probably had interactions with Evan in the past, so maybe he's someone who can be a bit of a saving grace to answer your question, Alan.
I believe Evan's in the upper house, but anyway, there's another question here, just quickly, just a plug for the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. Yes, we have memberships. You can find them online. We might be tweaking that membership system soon, and when we do that, we'll say, look, the best way to keep in touch is to make sure you're on our email list if you're not already. Jump onto the website. I'll show you the website here, and find a way that you'll be able to sign up to the email list there, and you'll be able to get more information about how to stay in touch with what we do.
There was another question I wouldn't mind responding to. I thought there was a good question, John, if we've got time.
I'll run through a bunch of these now. I'll vote for whoever promises to repeal Dan Andrews' pension plus benefits. All right. Which question is it?
What happens if there's another downgrade? Look, I mean, their borrowing costs would increase, the interest rates. I mean, they might.
I promise I'll go to that. Just
okay.
On the topic Barclay brought up, just for the continuity. A lot of good people are good before they go into politics. Then they don't always quite live up to expectation. Then they eventually get voted out and they're great again. There seems to be a consistent theme. I haven't been following closely, so I'm not trying to throw shade at Evan. But if people have been disappointed, it is somewhat of a theme. You get into the machine, you become a hack, you get out of the machine, you become a human again. I hope that at some stage, some of these otherwise good people decide, screw it, I don't need the ABC to like me. What I need to do is try and do the right thing. And if I flame out, but someone has to try and do the right thing. I hope more people start taking that attitude. It's easy for me to say I'm not elected, but not everyone agrees with your hope there, including with Alan, I fear to say. Now, where was that question? Here we go. This was the question you wanted to answer, Gene. Go for it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what we'll see is there'll be a spike in their borrowing costs, so the interest rates that they have to pay on their borrowings, because fewer investors will be interested in their bonds, in their paper. And this is where I think we'd get into the start of a federal bailout. Potentially, there's a possibility maybe the federal government could come in with some state debt guarantee where they guarantee certain bond issues. They give it a stamp. This is what happened during the financial crisis for a while. There were some of the bond issues from the states where the federal government explicitly backed it, and they they charged a little fee to the states for that, but the actual improvement in their having that stamp meant that their borrowing costs were lowered by so much that they could afford to pay it. So maybe you see something like that. It'd be a big deal if it occurred. I mean, that'd be an absolute laughing stock, really. I mean, it'd just be it'd be quite extraordinary if it happened. So yeah, let's wait and see.
There was another comment that I missed earlier. I did Alan's one, the one before Alan, which was saying a very similar thing, that the Curtin and Kane governments had lower debt. How can we get out of this? So I brought this one up for the last question. How on earth do we practically get out of it? Well, you have to just make spending cuts that the voting public don't like, risk getting voted out of government to do the right thing, to put the state and the country back on the right footing. That someone's eventually going to have to do that, or we just sleepwalk our way to Argentina. I can't see that there's a third option. There's not really a kumbaya, the aliens save us option. We either fix it or we don't. Fixing it will be politically painful. So either somebody shows up who can do the politically difficult things, or we sleepwalk our way, blindfolded and drunk off the edge of that debt cliff eventually. But I just say, before we get that depressed, I'd like to make you a little bit more depressed. And that is that I think the fiscal situation is slightly worse than this. And that is, we don't just have the current debt and profligate politicians who are scared of getting voted out. We also have, and Jean, you and I have talked about this before, we have the issue of an aging population, which means over the medium term, we're going to have fewer and fewer people in the bracket where they want to be hardworking, tax-paying, contributing citizens. And we're getting more people at the end of their life. Now, more of those people at the end of their life can work for longer. That's true. That's one of the rebuttals often given, and there's a lot of truth to that. But there's also truth to the fact that there is a lot of health and pension expenses at the end of life, especially health spending. Health spending is consistently growing at the federal and every state government level faster than GSP, faster than the economy is growing. And most of that is falling on the state and federal governments, the hospitals, and the Medicare system. And show me a way out of that. Because I talked before about politicians are going to eventually have to make difficult decisions. Show me the politician that's going to go to an election saying, I'm going to take away some of your health benefits. Health benefits and aged pensions. I mean, could you imagine? And the NDIS is the other unaffordable, ridiculous spending rort we have at the moment. Imagine going to an election saying, look, vote for me. I'm going to be great for the country. All I'm doing is, I'm just going to play around with aged pensions, the health system, and the NDIS. I have to just cut those back. But otherwise, vote for me. I would say that, but that's why I never get elected. Can you imagine someone from a major party having the gall to be that honest with the voting public? I hope we eventually see politicians that honest, but I'm not holding my breath right at the moment. So how do we get out of it? How do we get out of it, gents? Have I missed some white pill?
I think it does come down to rhetoric. I think we've got to make, the idea of it's not a cut, it's a saving. It's saving people money. It's saving people, it's lowering taxes for people. It's, meaning that we don't have to pay, $10 for a bag of potatoes when we go to the supermarket, that kind of thing. So I think if we reform the rhetoric more away from cuts, because they come with this negative connotation of someone coming through with a knife and slashing open your backpack, I think it would definitely help us in the long run. And, we can see that, it can be politically palatable to run on a platform of cutting federal government spending and federal government bureaucracy. The hope for us is it doesn't require us going down and getting to that 10 on the scale that we spoke about before of being like Argentina. The hope is that we can just get to 6 on that scale. Maybe we get to 30% of GSP, and then people suddenly start to realize and maybe they change their voting intention, and that, running on a platform of budget cuts or budget savings, let's start it right now. Let's start calling it budget savings, becomes politically palatable. And I take the point of, it seems to be the case that people who, they had a great track record of advocating for fiscal responsibility, people from the IPA, people from other, good centre-right think tanks and organisations, then going into a big political party machine, most commonly the Liberal Party, and completely betraying where they once stood on these kind of topics. So I think, definitely more people of principle could be a way to go, but also a change in rhetoric.
A couple of quick comments on that. One is in the Victorian budget papers that we're discussing in this very live stream, they specifically call them savings. So that politicians have been trying to use the rhetoric that helps them forever, and the media has been trying to use rhetoric that makes economically sensible people look bad forever. And the media gets to call us whatever they want to call us, and everyone else kind of copies that. And you copy the media leader because you don't want to look too crazy or silly. I mean, who would speak against the media? You look so silly. You have to like fall in line with what the very polite, well-dressed people from the ABC and Guardian say about the correct way of looking at the world. Barclay, sit down.
But it also comes from the opposition as well, John. So we're going to have John Pesutto come up and give a budget reply. I guarantee he'll say cuts more times than he'll say savings. So he's not contributing towards the rhetoric battle there, in my opinion. He's just trying to politically point score in favour of, trying to look like, he's slightly better than Labor, as opposed to, a complete restructuring of how we frame the discussion around budgets.
Absolutely. And apologies, Gene. I just keep having things I need to riff on when Barclay says this. Look, the quality of an opposition is hugely important. These days, I think the oppositions are doing, and this makes sense, right? You're in politics. You're doing everything you can to win. The problem with that is if everything you can to win includes doing things that hamstring you so you can never do good things once you're in power, why are you trying to win? And I think this is the problem some of these governments have. They use rhetoric, which helps drag down the other side, but it makes it impossible for them to ever do the right thing when they're in power. Then they just get in power, they tread water, they get a slightly higher income, they get jobs for their mates, and then they get voted out because the other side does to them what they did previously. And can I just say, that's very common these days. I want to give a shout out to someone who I think was somewhat overrated as a prime minister. I think the greatest thing that John Howard ever did was how he behaved as an opposition leader during the Hawke-Keating years. Because every time Hawke and Keating came out and said something unpopular and difficult and people didn't want to hear it, but it was right for the country and right for the economy, Howard came out and said, he could have come out and said, oh no, slashing, burning, they're hurting you, privatization bad. And that would have played well. That would have played well for him politically. Instead, he came out and said, you know what? They're right. Maybe I'll do it even more, but they're on the right direction. He backed it in. He supported it from opposition. He allowed them to get away with a good agenda. And that allowed this country to have those Hawke-Keating and early Howard year reforms that we've been free riding off for the last 20 years. So yeah, the language of opposition matters. One last thing though, another black pill. I'll get back to a white pill later after I let G speak. But one more black pill for what you're saying. The idea of language savings. Savings sounds like they're saving you. I get that's why you want the language. One of the problems in politics is if you try to sugarcoat what you're saying so much, people don't know what you're actually saying. And then when you get around to doing it, they feel like you lied to them. Like people eventually have to come to terms with the fact that you can't have infinite everythings. And we could say, oh, you can have infinite everythings. We just call them some everythings, right? If you change the language to try and win them over, no, that they need to come to terms with the fact that the government only has a finite access to resources. And it's not their resources. They take them off other people. So the more you want the government to do, the more they have to destroy the economy that is growing the income that you also say you want. We need to actually, I guess it's economic literacy. We eventually have to win the argument of saying we're on the path to ruin. We need to make it difficult. And we have to admit they're difficult. Not try and dress them up in a lipstick on a pig. We need to admit they're difficult and say they're difficult, but they're necessary and responsible. Because if we trick people into saying, oh yeah, let's vote for the nice savings, which is true, right? Call them savings. I'm just using that as an example, right? But if you kind of dress it up so nicely, people aren't really aware that there is a sting in the tail. When you do it, everyone's going to think you're the arsehole and you lied to them. And then they're going to react against it, do the opposite, and you're not going to be able to get the reform through. So that's one of the concerns I have, is that we do need to be somewhat honest in the way that we convince people that they can't have infinite everythings. Gene, I've been cutting you off several times, so.
It's okay, John. I mean, look, I mean, the politics is difficult. I mean, traditionally, how what's happened is that, the oppositions have gone along with the government in pretending things are sort of okay before the election. So there's no that people aren't concerned that there'll be these cuts after the election. And then they'll say, oh, actually, things are a lot worse than we expected. There'll be, an audit commission or something, and then they will have to enact unpopular measures. I expect some future government will have to do that in Victoria, even though they may not be making those noises pre-election. It's just going to have to happen. Now, I think one of the arguments in favour of 4-year terms is that, that it's more likely that governments can do, they can do sensible things early on and make some big changes, and then, see the benefits of that later on in future years and get rewarded for it at a future election. So, Yeah, I mean, I just think, I mean, they'll be forced to correct this eventually, probably sooner rather than later, just because it's so pressing. It's compromising their ability to deliver services to the people.
If the world made sense, they'd be forced to change direction soon. I'm not sure if that's the internal incentives that exist in politics. You're more likely to, as the opposition, overthrow the government by saying everything responsible they do is cruel, it's mean, it's cruel, and promising to give everybody. I mean, the best way to get elected is to drum up a fear campaign and make false promises. This has been, they've been refining that process over the course of the last 100 years. And I think over the course of the last 20 years, they've refined it pretty effectively, both sides of politics all around the Western world. And it's not clear to me until we can get those brave politicians, crazy brave, maybe they have to be crazy because they're not doing what's in their own interest for getting reelected. Until we can get some crazy brave politicians to come in again. And I do think to some degree the inevitability of it happening, you're saying that based on that inevitably has to happen. But the adjustment in the future could happen through a responsible person making responsible changes now, or it could be you fall off the cliff, smash, and you're forced to make all the changes overnight in a drastic and terrible way. So I agree that changes will happen. But I don't see where the political incentive is for them to happen responsibly unless we get more brave people into politics. So if you're one of the people listening right now, if you are brave, go into politics. If you are in politics, try to become more brave. That could be part of the solution. I have one last white pill on what we might be able to do on this. But Barclay, were you trying to get in on that, or should I just keep rolling? You're muted. All right. But I assume that...
No worries. Keep rolling.
So I've painted a pretty stark picture. I do have a suggestion for one way to say a modest suggestion. I love calling my suggestions modest. In terms of how we get somewhere from here, vouchers. I know you mentioned vouchers in education before, but I think vouchers can be done in health. The reason why this is not just a policy to improve choice and competition, to improve efficiency, which it certainly is, but it separates the provision from the funding. And everyone are addicted to a certain amount of government funding for health and education at the moment. I get that. And any politician trying to get reelected can't say we're undoing Medicare. I get that. But we can try and separate the funding from the provision. And then what that allows us to do is we're giving people, consider this as a hypothetical. The numbers are probably wrong. Say Medicare costs about $3,000 a year per person. I think that used to be the number when I first did this calculation. But for the sake of argument, just let's pretend. What we could do is say, all right, Medicare is now a mutual society that you have to pay a fee to join. And then you get all of the exact same benefits you have right now. All right. It's a mutual society that you pay a fee to join. The fee is $3,000. And the government gives you a $3,000 voucher to be used that has to be used to buy something exactly like Medicare. Now, to start with, the situation seems very similar, right? Who's worse off? How could you be worse off? A $3,000 bill, $3,000 that can only be used on something that looks like that bill. But what that allows us to do is, firstly, it allows us to have hopefully competition and get better quality healthcare. It also allows us to potentially start working out who needs that $3,000 voucher and how much do they need in the future. And if costs keep going up, but the government literally doesn't have money, you might not be able to increase that voucher to $4,000 next year and $5,000 the year after. You might have to increase it more slowly sometimes because the money's just not there. But we haven't pulled out the rug out from anyone of what they have today. We just set ourselves up so in the future it becomes possible to get on a different fiscal trajectory if we ever have the politician willing to pull that trigger. So I'd say this idea of separating the provision of the service from the funding of the service, continue funding the service, help maybe even continue the government providing the service to start with, but just separate the two. It opens up a possibility, a way forward where you can imagine the possibility of spending getting under control in the future. Without some sort of way to imagine spending getting under control in the future, it's hard to imagine where this goes next. I mean, if we had an esteemed lefty on this panel, they would say just increase tax. State governments don't have any more taxes left to increase. I mean, they just don't have access to the revenue heads. And federally, you could really pump up GST. That would get you some more income. There's not much room to go on the income tax, except at the low end.
Yeah. And it doesn't solve the problem long term, does it? I mean, the fundamental problem's been a spending problem. It's not actually a revenue problem.
Yeah, it depends how much you're spending, right? If a government was operating at 5% of GDP and they wanted to spend more, yes, you could tax more and you'd probably be able to get away with it. But we're not there, right? We're at 40 or over 40% of GDP already. So at that point, there's just not so much blood you can get from a stone.
Yeah. I had Dan Mitchell. One final point, because I'll plug a podcast episode I recorded with Dan Mitchell, renowned fiscal expert in the US. And the way he said it is like, if you look at he looked at the data for European countries back in the 60s and 70s when they started increasing revenue, they introduced value-added taxes. And you'd think that with all of this, and they boosted their revenue to GDP by 5 to 10%, you think, oh, this is great. They're going to be so much better off. Their budget balances and debt will be so much better than otherwise. And yet at the end of that period, they've all got more debt, right? So it's increasing taxes is not the solution.
Yeah, well, the other example you have is when they started cutting those tax rates, because the tax rates got up to, I think in Australia, up to 70-something%, the top marginal tax rate.
Yeah.
It got up to 95% in the UK, which, by the way, was the inspiration for the Beatles writing the song Taxman. If you remember that song, and the lyrics saying 19 for you and 1 for me because I'm the tax man. That's 19 for you, 1 for me. That's the 95% tax rate they had in the UK. But anyway, and I think it was 87% or something like that in the US. And then those drastically came down. And as they came down at exact that moment, revenue started to go up. And then you can dig in, well, who's paying the extra revenue? The people in the high brackets. They are now reporting a lot more income, right? It becomes a much bigger incentive to make the money, to admit you're making the money, to report the money, to not bother going through your various tax accountants and your tax lawyers. There's 1,001 ways to change your taxable income. And if you have ridiculous tax rates, people pursue those paths. And if you don't have ridiculous tax rates, you're able to actually collect tax on that earned income. So yeah, there is no way at this point, with the government already being at 40% or above 40% of GDP, there is no taxing solution to this problem. You could tweak it. I'm sure you could get a few more percent. You could get quite a few more percent if you're willing to just bleed the poor, right? Because that is the most efficient way and the only real way that you're going to be able to get much more revenue, which I don't think you should, by the way. I'm not saying that as a suggestion. I'm just saying that if you're a lefty that wants to pursue, let's tax our way out of the problem, just be aware that the only real group of people that you're going to be able to tax and get the money from. I mean, you could put a tax on rich people, but you're not going to get the money from them. The only people you can get the money from are the lower middle class and the working class. So assuming we don't want to do that, then the only option is brave decisions or fiscal cliff. Your choice. So that's not to say it's all over. We can just have brave decisions. We've got there's a couple of hundred people listening to this, and they can be the ones that be the brave politicians, the politicians who become brave, or the brave people that become politicians. Let's go out and fix the country. Starting with Victoria, apparently, because that's the budget that we're looking at today that we've forgotten to talk about for the last 20 minutes. All right, gents, any final comments?
No, John. I mean, other than reinforcing your point about how you've got a choice of being responsible now and making sensible decisions now, or what? How do you express it, or having to just do it all in a rush and make these big changes later because things are just so bad? You've really got to take drastic action. I like the way you express that trade-off before, that choice that you've got, and I think you really nailed it there.
Yeah, some sort of spending restraint is going to happen. Either we can do it carefully and responsibly now, or we can fall off the fiscal cliff and have to do it in a disaster setting. Thank you for that, Gene. And thank you very much for coming in, Gene. Thank you for giving up an hour and a half of your day, and hope you'll come back so we can talk federal budget next week. Barclay,
pleasure. It's always good fun, John, and Barclay. I love all your lateral thinking on these issues. So it's terrific.
Barclay, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think well, it's been great to chat. I think and unpack the Victorian budget. I think we might have a few university students listening in today, and as a token young person, I think the best metaphor that comes to mind when I think about particularly the case of Victoria, it's like you've got a university assignment coming up. You get close to the deadline, and you've taken out 2 extended loans because you faked a medical certificate to the doctor. And now we're getting to the end of that 2-week extension that we asked for. And it's getting to the point where now we're even going to have to cop, reductions on the potential grade that we're able to get for this university assignment if we don't start actually just going ahead and doing the work of repaying that debt. So we're getting into pretty bad territory whereby we're actually having to, incur late penalties, which is the closure of a lot of these projects, the delay of the suburban rail loop. The ending of the Commonwealth Games, that's been torn up completely. And it's really starting to affect, everyday lives of Victorians. I mean, the amount of people that have been put out, particularly by the Commonwealth Games. I mean, the amount of government contracts that were issued that are now just being thrown in the bin because people didn't read some bailout clause on page 54 of the contract that they signed. It's really causing a lot of heartache, and a lot of people are voting with their feet. They're actually moving interstate. The net interstate migration, I tend to think, we've seen it over in the US with people flocking away from California. For those who maybe aren't aware of the metaphor I'm going for, California is essentially our Victoria as far as budgets go. They're all flocking to other states like Texas and Florida, and I think that's what's happening here in Australia. Whilst Queensland's no holy grail to hold up, as Jean has publicly pointed out, and a quick plug for Jean's book, Queensland, Beautiful One Day Broke the Next. It was a fantastic book. I think it's really good. You should read it. And I think that it's really important that we understand where they're going down to Victoria, and that we see if we can rewrite that soon. But thank you to everyone for tuning in. Make sure you tune in to our next one on May 15 when we break down the federal government budget, which will be very, very interesting. Over to you, John.
Well, we hope it'll be interesting. We haven't seen it yet. But,
yes.
Well, as interesting as budgets can be. Thank you, Barclay, for coming in again. Thank you for everyone who showed up, who commented in. I don't think I worked out the tech for this, getting people in on the Zoom rooms, but we did manage to get Xavier in. So thank you, Xavier Boffa, for showing up and giving your hot take as the only actual Victorian that got into this room to talk about the Victorian budget. The highlights for me, which aren't necessarily the highlights for normal people, but as I mentioned before, they say it's a $2 billion deficit. It's actually a $15 billion underlying cash deficit, as you see on the scroller at the bottom of the screen. Ever since I mentioned it, I've put it up for everyone to reread, force you to reread it over and over again. That should be comment worthy by the media. The other point is, even if you believe it's a $2 billion deficit, that includes $6 billion of new recurrent spending just in this year. So even if you want to use the wrong budget measure of $2 billion deficit, it should have been a $4 billion surplus. And again, very little commentary on that, because it seems every year there's a possibility for the government to just sit on their hands for 1 year. Sometimes they'll need to do it for 2 years. Like the longer they make, the bigger they make the disaster, the more they're going to have to do it. But so often, if they just did nothing for a year, they could get the budget back in good shape. And I don't see any government or opposition trying that. So maybe here's a suggestion. If anyone's listening, maybe try that. Just spend 1 year of your term doing nothing. Just go on holiday, sit on a beach, do nothing for a year, come back in a year, and the budget will have hopefully gotten, actually, don't worry about the beach part, but you get the idea. Stop the new spending. $6 billion worth of new spending that's gone through to the keeper. I appreciate the fact that they have started making slightly more responsible decisions about their capital expenditure, because you can't keep spending money that doesn't exist. And eventually we're going to have to get that point across both to the voting public and to the politicians who get voted in. And this is a good step that the government that's followed on from Dan Andrews seems to have taken 1 out of 5 stars in terms of, being aware that they can't continue going down that path forever without destroying their state. So those were my takeaways from this budget. If you have other ones, please feel free to put them in the comments below. We won't be able to share them anymore, except for this final one. We won't be able to share them anymore because we're going to stop this live stream. But of course, you can comment below, keep the conversation going, chat with each other. Please like this page wherever you are. If you're on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, and by the way, whichever one you're on, please go to the other two and like us there as well, so that you can find us next time. If you're not on the ATA's email list, please go and try and get yourself on that email list. And we'll see you next week. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, gents.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. See you later.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, John.